This is a story of Esteban, a judge who used to deal with all kinds of crimes and criminals in his work, but who found by chance in the street and not in the courts where he worked, the most terrifying case of all the people. He'd ever heard of it all started one afternoon when Esteban left his office. It hadn't been a good day. The night before he'd signed the divorce papers with his wife after marriage of years. She didn't give him any explanation. She simply informed him of her decision to separate. As a result, that day Esteban had not been able to concentrate on his work, and when he left the office, he was deeply tired. He got into his car and decided that he would not go straight home, facing the loneliness of his home, where until recently his wife was always waiting for him, could be painful. And it was then that he made a seemingly foolish decision, but one that would change his life forever. Also, if you have not done so already, please subscribe to our channel and click that notification bell to get inspired by these real-life stories. Every day now, back to the story, he wandered aimlessly through the streets of the city, looking to make some time earlier, and it was in the middle of the spontaneous wandering through the streets of the city that Esteban saw him at first. He thought it was a pile of badly stacked garbage, but as this car got closer, he found the color of the garbage bag strange skin-colored. It was only when he was a few meters away that Esteban would see to his horror what the lump was really about. It wasn't garbage bags. It was the human body of an obese person, completely naked. Esteban didn't think twice without fearing that the people who attacked the man were still around and would attack him too. Esteban stopped the car with great difficulty. He climbed into the back of the car and tried to give him first aid. The obese man's pulse was weak and didn't respond to any of Esteban's attempts to revive him. In desperation, he returned to his seat and drove desperately to the nearest hospital there. The obese and unconscious man was admitted to the hospital and began an uphill battle against death, although Esteban's job as a judge was not to investigate, but rather make judgments based on evidence and investigations conducted by others. He felt he could not sit idly by, and he filed a lawsuit for damages against the man weakly thrown in the street. The problem was that since he was completely naked without any personal documents, it was very difficult to identify him. Added to this was the fact that the area where he'd been found had no security cameras. It was as if the criminals who beat him and left him lying there had their macabre plan coldly calculated to avoid being discovered, for better or for worse. The matching of the subject's fingerprints with a police database made it possible to identify him, as he had a criminal record. The obese man's name was Victor, and a couple of years earlier, he'd been caught for showing up at a restaurant as a weapon, asking for the police to be called once the police arrived. The man allowed himself to be captured without putting up any kind of resistance. He seemed happy to be caught at the trial. Victor's lawyer had been able to prove that the gun with which he presented himself at the restaurant was a toy. This added to the testimony of the people present, who affirmed that Victor didn't rob anyone and was kind, and added to Victor's sobbing repentance made it possible for the judge to sentence the man to probation. It was evident that he was not a danger to society and that his act in the restaurant was nothing more than a desperate measure of an emotionally unstable person who was probably depressed because of his obesity. That is why the judge in that case ruled that, in addition to a bail, Victor's probation would be subject to the man's commitment to undergo psychological therapy. In Esteban's eyes, the discovery of this background only raised questions about the case. Had the attempted robbery in the restaurant been more than a desperate measure, perhaps Victor was involved in shady business dealings for which they tried to kill him. However, Esteban was deeply disappointed when he learned that these doubts were not shared by the investigators handling the case for them. Victor's background allowed them to conclude that on this occasion it was also an episode of depression due to his obesity, and that since there were no other culprits but the subject himself, the case could be considered closed. It did not matter that Victor's body showed signs of bruises. It was explained that these bruises had been the result of fainting in the street, and the case was closed. Esteban, however, had taken this as a personal matter and was not willing to give up with the information provided by the court file found in the police archives. Esteban located the psychologist who treated Victor and interviewed him at first. It was not easy to gain his trust because, despite Esteban's status as a judge, the psychologist did not want to give him any information about Victor's sessions without a court order, and with the case closed, Esteban Despite his status as a judge had no legal grounds to issue such a court order, so he went on to tell him in detail about the case of Victor who'd been found, naked and beaten in the street. He told her that the man was still lying unconscious in a hospital fighting between life and death. However, the police had closed the case and he was personally looking for more information with which to get the truth of the story. Only then did the psychologist, convinced that there was something shady behind it all, give us to Bon Victor's diaries. In those diaries, Esteban wrote a terrifying truth. Victor was the youngest of 3 brothers from an affluent family. Since his adolescence, he'd begun to suffer from a morbid obesity that he could not control with anything. But the worst part of his situation was the constant mockery to which he'd been subjected by his siblings, who began to hate him and make his life impossible. The father, at the time of his death, had left all the properties in Victor's name, hoping that with them, the mockery of his brothers would disappear. But far from it, the brothers increased their abuses against Victor, seeking to make him commit suicide, and then they could finally inherit their late father's properties. It was then that Victor, believing he would be better off in jail, and with his brothers, tried to rob a restaurant with the sole purpose of being caught by the police. But during the trial, he realized that he was committing madness, repented, and was able to avoid jail. In the newspapers, there was no explicit account of what had happened that day when Victor appeared, naked and beaten in the street. But for Esteban, there was no doubt his brothers had been the culprits. They tried to kill him in order to inherit his property, and for that reason, with the newspapers as a legal argument, he issued an arrest against Victor's brothers, who were captured a few hours later during the trial. The subjects confessed everything, that they tried to murder their brother to keep his inheritance. So they stripped him naked, beat him, put him in a car, and threw him out of it while it was moving. The irony is that at the moment of planning that macabre plan, the subjects forgot a small detail. At the time of his death, his father had sworn that only Victor would inherit his money, and that legally everything was ready to make sure of that by means of a legal figure. Everything was already arranged, so if Victor died, his properties would not be inherited by his siblings, but by a foundation that would help people affected by obesity. Victor's death, if it had occurred, would have been in vain. Fortunately, Victor managed to survive. After leaving the hospital, he and Esteban became good friends, and in the warmth of that friendship and realizing that life had given him a second chance, Victor found the strength he needed to decide to try nutrition and exercise diet. That would allow him to overcome his extreme obesity and change his life.